The first time I saw her, she was sitting on the curb outside my little auto shop, shoulders shaking, tears streaking down her perfectly made-up face, and a flat tire glaring up at me like a neon sign of trouble. I had been cleaning the grease off my hands after finishing a late shift on an old Chevy when I noticed her, too young to be dealing with this kind of mess alone, her designer bag tossed haphazardly to the side, her phone lying cracked on the asphalt. Something about the way she looked, helpless but proud, desperate but insisting she didn't need help, made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. Most people in my town knew me as the single dad mechanic, a man who'd been mocked endlessly by the neighbors, whispers of my failed marriage following me like a shadow. But I couldn't walk past her. My gut told me, this isn't just a flat tire. She flinched when I approached, probably expecting judgment. And maybe she had good reason. I couldn't even begin to guess how many kids from affluent families like hers thought the world owed them an apology just for existing. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual even though my voice was thicker than I wanted. Looks like you've got a flat. Need a hand? She looked me up and down, from my oil-stained overalls to my tired sneakers, and let out a small incredulous laugh, like I had just proposed some absurd joke. I can handle it, she stammered, voice shaky, but her hands fumbled nervously with the jack in the trunk. It was then I realized she didn't really know how. She had been pretending for almost 10 minutes, all the while fighting back tears. I dropped to my knees beside the tire, rolling up my sleeves, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Listen, I said more firmly this time, it's okay to admit you can't do this alone. It happens to the best of us. Her laugh this time was bitter, almost sharp. Yeah, okay, the single dad mechanic is going to rescue me. That's adorable. I froze for a moment, the words stinging more than she could have known. Most people had no idea the loneliness, the night spent trying to make ends meet while raising my son alone, had carved deep lines into my face and patience into my soul. Yet something inside me softened. I couldn't let her sarcasm dictate my actions, not when I could do something that mattered. The air smelled faintly of rain and oil, a strange mix that somehow grounded me as I got to work. A flat's not too bad, I said quietly, more to myself than to her, as I inspected the tire. It just needs a new patch and some air. She watched me silently, her pride tangled with embarrassment, and I could feel her walls slowly crumbling. As I worked, she finally spoke, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. Wait, would you help me? You don't even know me. I glanced at her, catching a glimpse of vulnerability beneath the veneer of money and sophistication she carried like armor. I paused, wiping my hands on a rag. Because nobody should cry alone on the side of the road, I said simply. She blinked at me, like she wasn't used to people saying things like that without an angle, without judgment. Minutes passed, stretching longer than they should have. I could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, but inside the bubble of my garage, there was only the sound of metal against rubber, her occasional sniffles, and my own heartbeat slowing down as I focused on something real for the first time that day. She started to talk, hesitantly at first, about her day, about a party, a car accident, her mom being impossible, and her voice was trembling with the weight of a life she had never been allowed to show anyone. I listened. Not just the words, but the fear, the pressure, the isolation of growing up rich but utterly alone. By the time I finished with her tire, her face had softened, a fragile, real smile breaking through for the first time. As I handed her the wrench and watched her carefully test the wheel, she finally whispered, thank you. It wasn't enough. It was a word that carried years of pride, arrogance and insecurity, all boiling over in a single syllable. I nodded, unsure what else to say, feeling strangely light and strangely heavy at the same time. She got into the car, paused, and turned back toward me, eyes glistening. You're not like anyone else, she said. And I realized, maybe for the first time in my life, that being a not like anyone else didn't have to be a curse. It could be a bridge, a lifeline, a quiet act of kindness that changed someone's world in a single afternoon. I waved as she drove off, a small part of me expecting to never see her again, dismissing the thought immediately because that's how life went for people like me. We gave what we could and we rarely received anything back. But deep down, a strange unease settled in my chest, a sense that the encounter wasn't over. That this day, this flat tire, had a story yet to unfold that neither of us could imagine. And as I closed the garage door behind me, wiping the sweat from my brow, I didn't realize that the quiet act of kindness I had offered on a sunlit ordinary Tuesday was about to spiral into something far larger, far more shocking, and entirely unexpected. The next morning my phone rang, and the voice on the other end wasn't just any call, it was a voice that would change everything. The phone call came just as I was sipping my morning coffee, the steam curling lazily above the chipped mug that had been in my hands longer than I'd care to admit. I almost dropped it when I heard the voice on the other end, a crisp authoritative tone, commanding but with an undercurrent of urgency that made my chest tighten. "Is this, Mr. Harper?" she asked. I hesitated, unsure if she knew my name or if this was some scam, one of those ridiculous calls people get all the time. "Yes, speaking," I said cautiously, my voice rough from yesterday's long hour. There was a pause, and then she continued, softer now, almost uncertain, as if trying to gauge my reaction. "This is Margaret Vanstone. I'm calling regarding my daughter." My heart skipped a beat. Margaret Vanstone, the name carried weight, a household name in our city, synonymous with wealth, influence and untouchable social circles. I sat down heavily, coffee forgotten, and a cold sweat prickled my neck. She explained quickly but carefully, each word measured, like a diplomat delivering news in a war room. Apparently the events of the day before hadn't gone unnoticed. Her daughter, the girl on the curb, had called her in tears that evening, recounting the entire incident with a raw honesty that even the Vanstones, with their pristine public images, couldn't control. Margaret Vanstone didn't scold or reprimand, she sounded relieved. Relieved that her daughter had encountered someone who treated her not as an entitled kid, not as a trophy, but as a human being who needed help. And then came the part that made me stiffen with disbelief. She wanted to thank me, in person, not with money, not with some grandiose gesture of charity, but personally, because something in my small cluttered garage had reached her daughter in a way nothing else ever had. I laughed nervously, almost in disbelief. "You want to meet me? Why?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. She explained that her daughter had insisting that whoever had fixed her tire, whoever had treated her with kindness when she was most vulnerable, needed to be recognized. Margaret Vanstone's tone was gentle, but there was a sharp edge beneath it, one that conveyed both power and sincerity. She wanted to meet me at her home the next day, a sprawling estate I had driven past countless times, a place I had never, and probably would never, be invited inside. My son Sam had been waiting at the table, his cereal long forgotten, eyes wide as I repeated the details, trying to process the impossible reality that our quiet lives were about to intersect with theirs. I couldn't stop thinking about her daughter, about the cracked phone, the designer bag slumped against the curb, and those trembling hands. I remembered how she had flinched when I approached, and yet, she had let me in. How had a simple act of helping someone change a tire become something that shook the Vanstone household? And more importantly, what would it mean for me, for Sam, for the little life we had been building from the ground up in our quiet corner of the world? As I cleaned the shop later that afternoon, my mind kept drifting to the tire, to the way her eyes had softened, and to the fragile bridge of trust we had formed in those brief tense minutes. It was a bridge built on nothing more than honesty, compassion and patience, qualities often overlooked in a world obsessed with wealth and status. The next morning, nerves churned in my stomach as I drove toward the Vanstone estate. The driveway was long and pristine, lined with trees that seemed to whisper secrets of generations past. I parked my old pickup truck alongside the manicured lawns, feeling conspicuously out of place, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. The door opened, and Margaret Vanstone herself appeared, impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of calm authority that made my stomach twist with nerves. Her eyes, however, held warmth, a subtle acknowledgement that she had come not to intimidate but to connect. "Thank you for coming," she said simply, gesturing for me to follow her inside. Her voice carried the kind of quiet power that made you listen, made you believe, and made you feel simultaneously small and seen. Inside, her daughter was waiting, sitting stiffly on a leather sofa, hands folded in her lap, a mixture of embarrassment and relief painted across her youthful face. "This is the man," Margaret said softly, almost reverently, "who didn't laugh at you, who didn't judge you, who—" She stopped, letting her words linger in the air, heavy with meaning. Her daughter's gaze finally met mine, and in that moment, the world outside the estate seemed to vanish. There was no wealth, no status, no privilege. There was only two people, connected briefly through an act of kindness that had changed the course of a day, and possibly more than that. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, unable to find the words that could carry the gravity of the moment. She stood, hesitantly, and extended her hand, then paused, unsure, before enveloping mine in a hug instead. It was awkward, uncertain, and deeply human, a moment of vulnerability from someone who had been raised to be untouchable. And as I held her, feeling the tremor in her shoulders, I realized that the act of helping her yesterday, something so simple to me, had reached her in a way no lecture, no privilege, no wealth ever could. Margaret watched silently, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't name, perhaps pride, perhaps relief, perhaps awe at the realization that her daughter had experienced genuine human kindness for the first time. Then she spoke quietly, almost a whisper. "I think this is the start of something important, for both of you." And I realized in that single sentence, that my life, our life, had just tilted on its axis. The shy, scared girl on the curb had unknowingly opened a door not just for herself, but for me, for Sam, for the quiet dignity of people who work hard and love harder, even when the world laughs at them. And in that moment, the enormity of what kindness could do, how it could ripple far beyond a simple flat tire, hit me like a freight train, leaving me breathless, stunned, and strangely, full of hope. The following days were surreal. My shop suddenly felt smaller, more cramped somehow, though it was exactly the same space I'd been in for years, surrounded by the familiar smell of oil and rubber. Everything outside seemed sharper, louder, as if the world had realized that something extraordinary had happened and was now watching. My phone buzzed incessantly, calls, messages, even emails I hadn't checked in months, all from people connected to the Vanstones, or so I suspect. But I couldn't let it distract me from what mattered. My son Sam, sitting beside me at the workbench, wide-eyed and fascinated as I explained what had happened. "Are we really going to meet them again?" he asked, his voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my own emotions in check. "Yes, Sam. But remember, we're still us. We can't let all this shine and glitter change who we are." He nodded solemnly, as if understanding that life sometimes handed you surreal moments to test your character, not your ego. The next visit to the Vanstone estate was unlike the first. This time, it wasn't just a courtesy call, there was an air of ceremony, almost theatrical in its tension. Margaret Vanstone greeted me with the same composed grace, but her eyes held an intensity I hadn't noticed before. She led us through vast halls adorned with priceless art and sculptures, the kind of opulence that could make a person feel insignificant, like ants wandering through a palace. Yet, as we moved through the corridors, her daughter kept glancing at me, her expression oscillating between awe, shame, and gratitude. I noticed her fiddling with the hem of her dress, like a small human gesture struggling to survive in a world built on perfection. She was no longer just a girl on the curb. She was a young woman grappling with privilege, pressure, and the raw vulnerability that I had glimpsed before. Margaret paused in a grand library, the kind with shelves reaching the ceiling and a faint scent of aged paper that always felt sacred. "Want you to know," she said, voice steady, "that we've never had anyone treat her with the respect and dignity you showed yesterday. And it means more than I can articulate." I felt my throat tight. People say things like that, but hearing it from her, seeing the sincerity etched across her face, made me feel exposed, as though my heart had been held up for scrutiny. "It was nothing," I said, almost instinctively, brushing it off, though I knew she wouldn't be fooled. Margaret's gaze was sharp. "A nothing? You call saving someone's dignity, their trust, nothing?" My hands itched, wanting to gesture to explain, but words felt clumsy in a room like this. So I stayed quiet, letting the silence do the talking, and her daughter finally spoke, voice trembling slightly. "But Dad didn't, I mean you didn't just fix my tire," she whispered, her eyes locking onto mine. You saw me, really saw me. Nobody has ever done that." The word struck me with an almost painful intensity. I wanted to tell her it was my job, it was my nature, that kindness didn't require recognition, but her eyes, the way they were shining with tears she fought to contain, made me realize that this moment, this bridge we had built, was bigger than me, bigger than the shop, bigger than the world we came from. And in that moment, I felt the fragile thread of humanity connecting us, bridging gaps that money, status, and pretense had created for generations. Margaret's voice cut softly into the silence. We know it may seem sudden, but I would like you to consider helping my daughter more. Not in material ways, but guiding her, teaching her to navigate life with integrity and compassion. You have something we've never been able to give her, genuine human insight grounded in reality. My mind raced. Me? Teach a billionaire's daughter? Guide her? Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity, at the irony of life tossing me into this world I had never belonged. But another part, the part that had learned long ago that kindness, once given, has its own gravity, felt an unfamiliar stir of responsibility, a sense that maybe this was why we had met, why the flat tire had happened, why she had cried on my curb. We spent hours in that library. Her daughter asked questions, hesitated, sometimes withdrew, then returned, each moment peeling back layers of fear, pride, and loneliness. She spoke of parties she hated, of expectations that suffocated, of friends who judged her for the wrong reasons, and I listened. I told her about my struggles, about raising Sam alone, about nights when I wondered if I was doing enough, about learning kindness in a world that often rewards cruelty. She laughed softly at my stories, sometimes incredulously, sometimes with quiet admiration, and with every exchange, I realized that this wasn't just a lesson for her, it was a lesson for me too. Life, I was learning, had a way of giving back in measures far beyond the scale of one person's actions. By the time we left the estate that evening, the sun had begun to dip behind the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold and purple. I watched her daughter as she waved goodbye, a real smile on her face, not the rehearsed, polished expressions of a child born into wealth, but a genuine reflection of a young person beginning to understand empathy, humility, and human connection. Sam was bouncing with excitement in the truck, unable to stop talking about the grandeur of the estate, the books, the art, but I remained quiet, contemplating the invisible threads that had brought us together. A flat tire, a chance encounter, a moment of vulnerability, it was all part of something bigger, something that neither I nor the Vanstones could have predicted. And yet, as I drove home, a subtle tension lingered in my chest. There was something unspoken in Margaret's eyes, a weight I couldn't quite place. Something about the way she had watched us interact suggested that while this bridge of kindness had been built, it also carried responsibility, and perhaps consequences we had yet to understand. I had stepped into a world far removed from my own, but the pull of it was undeniable. The simple act of helping a crying teen had triggered a chain of events that could change everything, and somewhere deep inside, I knew that the story was far from over. This was only the beginning, and the next twist, the one that would truly test all of us, was coming faster than I could imagine. It was a week later when the real storm hit, quiet at first, like the distant rumble of thunder warning of a lightning strike. I was closing up the shop for the night, wiping my hands on a rag that smelled faintly of motor oil and coffee, when Sam tugged at my sleeve. "I did. She's here," he whispered, eyes wide. I froze, heart thumping in a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. There, standing outside under the dim glow of the street lamp, was her, the girl from the curb, the one who had cried on my asphalt, now looking smaller, somehow more vulnerable than before. She didn't rush toward me, she didn't smile. She just stood there, shifting nervously, hands clutched in front of her, like she was carrying the weight of the world. Something about the way she looked, the hesitation in her movements, told me this wasn't a casual visit. This was urgent. She stepped inside quietly, letting the shop's familiar smells wrap around her, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and in that small cluttered space, time seemed to stretch thin. Finally, she blurted out, voice trembling, "I made a huge mistake, and it's all my fault." My stomach sank. I had expected questions, gratitude, maybe a laugh about our previous encounters, but never this. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, steady, even as a cold pit formed in my gut. She swallowed hard, eyes flicking to Sam, who watched silently from his perch on the counter. It's my mom. She's in trouble. Big trouble, and I didn't know who else to call." Her voice cracked, and for the first time I saw fear, not the fleeting fear of a flat tire, but a deep gnawing fear that could swallow someone whole. As she told me the story, details spilled out in a torrent. Margaret Vanstone's company had stumbled into a scandal, one that threatened not just her reputation, but the livelihood of hundreds of employees. A corrupt business partner had siphoned funds, leaked information, and suddenly, the Vanstone empire, her mother's meticulously built world, was on the brink of public scrutiny. The media was circling, reporters sniffing like vultures waiting to tear everything apart. And her daughter, she had seen some of the irregularities, but had been paralyzed by fear and loyalty. Now she was desperate, seeking refuge in the one place that had felt safe, the one place where she had been treated like a human being rather than a headline or a problem to solve. I listened, my hands gripping the edge of the workbench, realizing that this was far beyond a tire or a simple act of kindness. This was life or ruin, and somehow we were at the center of it. Sam leaned closer, whispering, Dad, what are we going to do? I took a deep breath, looking from my son to the trembling girl, and something inside me shifted. The world we had known, the small, predictable life of greasy overalls and late-night homework sessions, was gone. In its place was chaos, danger, and the kind of responsibility I had never asked for but couldn't turn away from. We help her, I said quietly, voice steady, though my heart pounded like a jackhammer. Her eyes, wide and glistening, reflected a mixture of relief and disbelief. You'll really do that? She whispered. I nodded, feeling a fierce protective surge that startled even me. Because sometimes kindness doesn't stop at a flat tire, it expands, grows, and becomes the thing that saves lives. The next hours were a blur of planning, secrecy, and quiet strategy. I called in favors, contacted old friends, and even some of the people I had helped over the years in small, unnoticed ways. Sam helped too, more capable than I expected, running errands, fetching information, offering ideas with the sort of insight that only a child raised on honesty and resilience could provide. Her presence in the shop, the way she sometimes peeked into corners, shy, but increasingly determined, was a reminder of why we were doing this. This wasn't about money, about prestige, about recognition. This was about protecting someone who had been thrust into a world too large, too cruel, too fast, and giving her the chance to survive it with dignity intact. Then came the moment that made everything surreal. A private investigator, hired by Margaret in secret, arrived with documents, photos, and names, proof of the betrayal within her empire. She handed them to me, eyes wide with fear, as if passing a ticking bomb into my hands. This could ruin her, she whispered, or worse. I nodded, scanning the files, each revelation worse than the last. Embezzlement, lies, manipulation, all orchestrated by someone no one suspected, someone who had been part of the inner circle. I felt a surge of anger, not for money, not for business, but for the fear and betrayal that had reached her daughter, that had shaken her world to its core. We'll handle it, I said, voice low, filled with a determination I hadn't felt since raising Sam alone after his mother left. We'll fix this. Together, hours turned into a night spent planning, and by dawn, a strategy had emerged, careful, precise, moral, and dangerous. It involved exposing the traitor without endangering innocent lives, using the very skills and integrity I had honed in my humble shop for years. And as the first light of morning filtered through the dusty windows, her daughter looked at me with something I hadn't expected. Trust. Absolute, unwavering trust. I knew I could count on you, she whispered. I swallowed hard, realizing that the act of helping her change a tire had led us to this moment. A moment of profound responsibility, of moral courage, and of life-altering consequence. And just as we were about to set the plan in motion, the phone rang again. The voice on the other end was tense, clipped, unmistakable. It was her mother, Margaret Vanstone. She had received word that the situation was escalating faster than anyone anticipated. There were threats, legal entanglements, and the possibility of public exposure within hours. And in that split second, I realized that everything we had done to protect her, everything we had built, was about to be tested like never before. The calm of the shop vanished, replaced by a storm of urgency, fear, and the unshakable knowledge that the choices we made in the next few hours could change lives forever. By the time the sun was high, casting harsh light over the city, we were fully immersed in the storm Margaret's empire had unknowingly invited. Every phone call, every whisper of news, every anxious glance at her daughter reminded me that this was no longer about a flat tire or a chance encounter. It was about protecting innocence, dignity, and life itself. We worked tirelessly, moving quietly through the maze of legal filings, private contacts, and whispered warning. The Vanstone daughter stayed close, eyes wide with fear, yet slowly gaining confidence as she realized that the person who had changed her life with a simple act of kindness, the single dad she had once mocked, the mechanic she had called a savior, was now her anchor in a world spiraling out of control. Sam, too, proved invaluable, running errands, retrieving documents, and even soothing her when panic threatened to overwhelm. In that small shop, surrounded by oil stains and echoes of our ordinary lives, an extraordinary alliance had formed, one built not on wealth or privilege, but on trust, courage, and humanity. By late afternoon, the breakthrough came. Evidence we had compiled, documents verified, and a carefully orchestrated plan revealed the traitor within the company without endangering the innocent. Margaret Vanstone herself called, her voice trembling yet firm, confirming that the situation had been stabilized. The media had been redirected, potential leaks contained, and the scandal averted, but the lessons ran far deeper than mere crisis management. Her daughter looked at me with tears in her eyes, unguarded and raw. I don't know how to thank you," she said, voice cracking. Not just for today, or yesterday, but for everything. For seeing me, for believing in me when I couldn't even believe in myself." I shook my head, words failing me. I realized then that kindness doesn't always come in grand gestures or money. Sometimes, it comes in showing up, in being present, in offering someone your attention and compassion when they've been invisible to the world. Margaret Vanstone arrived at the shop later that evening. She wasn't imposing, not really. She was human, carrying the weight of a mother who had come face to face with fear, vulnerability, and gratitude all at once. "You've done more than fix a tire," she said quietly, eyes locked on mine. "You've given my daughter something she's never had. Someone who treats her like a person, someone who guides her without judgment. That's rare, that's priceless." I felt my throat tighten, a lump forming as the enormity of her words settled over me. In my life, I had been mocked, overlooked, and underestimated. People had judged me for being a single dad, a mechanic, someone who worked with his hands instead of his wallet. No, and yet in this moment, everything that had felt insignificant, everything that had been ridiculed, was suddenly extraordinary. Extraordinary. We spent the evening talking, sharing stories that transcended class, wealth, and status. Margaret's daughter opened up like never before, laughing, crying, and asking questions about a life she had only glimpsed through the lens of privilege. She listened to my stories of struggle and love, of nights spent comforting a frightened child, of learning that kindness often costs nothing but has infinite value. And I listened to her fears, her regrets, her hope, understanding that this was more than mentorship. It was a meeting of souls, two worlds colliding not with force, but with empathy. As the night deepened, and the city lights flickered outside the shop windows, I realized that we had all been transformed. The girl who had once cried on the curb was no longer scared, no longer fragile in the same way. She had been strengthened by kindness, guided by integrity, and reminded that someone, somewhere, sees her for who she truly is. Weeks later, life began to settle, though it was forever changed. The Vanstones extended a quiet, understated gratitude that was neither ostentatious nor patronizing. They offered opportunities, yes, but more importantly, they offered acknowledgement of a truth often ignored, that character, courage, and compassion matter far more than wealth or influence. And for me, for Sam, for that little shop that smelled of oil and hope, the encounter had left a permanent mark. We had learned that a single act of kindness, a moment of empathy when the world mocked, ignored, or judged, could ripple outward in ways unimaginable, changing lives, altering destinies, and forging connections stronger than any fortune. I often think back to that moment on the curb, to the trembling hands, the cracked phone, and the fear-filled eyes. At the time, I never imagined it would lead here, to late-night strategy sessions, to trust forged in the heat of crisis, to a bond between worlds that should never have met. But here we were, forever changed, reminded that kindness is not just an action, it is a force, capable of turning despair into hope, fear into courage, and strangers into family. And sometimes, just sometimes, a simple gesture, a tire fixed, a hand offered, a heart opened, can be the spark that ignites miracles in ways no one could predict. Because that day, That one ordinary day that began with a mocking glance and a crying teen on the side of the road, proved something extraordinary. That humanity, compassion, and courage are far more powerful than wealth, more enduring than fear, and infinitely more transformative than anyone ever realizes. And as I close the shop each night, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I know without doubt that we changed each other's lives forever, and that the smallest acts can indeed reshape the world.